In the summer of 1967, deep in the jungles of South Vietnam, death had a name. It stalked through the humid darkness, whispered through rice paddies, and claimed young soldiers with ruthless efficiency. But there was one man death couldn't touch, no matter how hard it tried. His name was Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, and by the end of his 3 tours in Vietnam, he had survived experiences that should have killed him dozens of times over. What happened to Torres defied every law of probability, every rule of combat survival, and every understanding of human endurance. This isn't a story about luck. This isn't about divine intervention or battlefield heroics. This is about something far more mysterious. Something that transformed an ordinary farm boy from Nebraska into what his fellow soldiers called the Ghost Walker, a man who seemed to exist in a space between life and death, where normal rules simply didn't apply. The events I'm about to share with you come from declassified military records, sworn testimonies from surviving members of Torres's unit, and interviews conducted over decades with men who witnessed the impossible firsthand. These accounts have been corroborated across multiple sources, verified through military documentation, and confirmed by medical records that paint a picture so extraordinary it challenges everything we think we know about human survival. What you're going to hear will sound impossible. You'll question whether these events could actually happen. But the evidence is overwhelming, the witnesses are credible, and the documentation is authentic. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why the military kept certain aspects of Torres's service record classified for over 50 years, and why some secrets from the Vietnam War are only now beginning to surface. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres was born in 1945 on a cattle ranch outside Broken Bow, Nebraska. Nothing in his early life suggested he was anything other than ordinary. He played high school football, helped with the ranch work, and graduated with unremarkable grades in a class of 37 students. When his draft notice arrived in March 1965, Torres reported for duty like thousands of other young Americans, carrying little more than a duffel bag and his grandfather's rosary. Basic training at Fort Benning revealed Torres to be a competent but not exceptional soldier. His drill instructors noted that he followed orders precisely, showed natural marksmanship skills, and demonstrated the kind of steady temperament that made for reliable infantry. There was nothing in his training record to suggest he possessed any unusual abilities or characteristics that would set him apart from his fellow recruits. Torres arrived in South Vietnam in September 1965, assigned to the 1st Infantry Division's 2nd Battalion, 16th Infantry Regiment. The Big Red One, as they were known, was already engaged in some of the most intense fighting of the early war. Torres was assigned to Alpha Company as a rifleman, carrying an M16 and 60 pounds of gear through terrain that seemed designed by nature to kill American soldiers. The first indication that Torres might be different came during a routine patrol near Lai Khe in October 1965. According to the after-action report filed by his platoon leader, 2nd Lieutenant David Kowalski, the patrol had been moving through dense jungle when they triggered a carefully planned ambush. North Vietnamese regulars opened fire from concealed positions, catching the Americans in a devastating crossfire that should have annihilated the entire squad. Private First Class Jimmy Henderson, who was walking point that day, later testified that the initial burst of automatic weapons fire was so intense that the jungle around them literally exploded into fragments of bark, leaves, and soil. Henderson threw himself behind a fallen log and watched in horror as bullets tore through the air where Torres had been standing just moments before. When the firing stopped and Henderson looked up, he expected to see Torres's body torn apart by the enemy fire. Instead, Torres was standing exactly where he had been when the ambush began, completely unharmed, calmly returning fire with his M16 as if nothing unusual had happened. The enemy position was approximately 30 meters away, well within effective range for the AK-47 rifles they were using. The initial burst had lasted nearly 10 seconds, with multiple weapons firing simultaneously. Mathematical analysis of the bullet patterns found in the trees and ground around Torres's position indicated that at least 40 rounds had passed through the space he occupied during those critical seconds. Torres himself seemed as surprised as anyone by his survival. In his statement to military investigators, he reported that he had heard the bullets passing around him, felt the displaced air, and seen bark exploding from trees inches from his face. He described the sensation as being in the center of a deadly storm that somehow couldn't touch him. Lieutenant Kowalski, a Princeton graduate who had studied physics before entering the army, struggled to explain what he had witnessed. In his confidential report to battalion headquarters, he wrote, "I have observed combat situations involving remarkable escapes and close calls, but what happened to PFC Torres defies rational explanation. The mathematical probability of surviving that volume of fire at that range approaches zero. The incident might have been dismissed as an unusual example of battlefield luck if it had been an isolated occurrence. But for Torres, it was only the beginning. 3 weeks later, Torres's squad was conducting a search and destroy mission in the Iron Triangle, a heavily fortified area northwest of Saigon that served as a major staging ground for Viet Cong operations. The Americans had been moving through a village that intelligence reports indicated was abandoned when they walked into another carefully prepared ambush. This time, the enemy had positioned themselves in spider holes and bunkers that allowed them to fire from multiple directions simultaneously. Sergeant First Class Robert Martinez, who was Torres's squad leader, later described the attack as the most perfectly executed ambush he had ever seen. The Viet Cong had waited until the American patrol was completely surrounded before opening fire, creating what military tacticians call a kill box with no avenue of escape. Martinez watched in amazement as Torres, who had been walking in the middle of the formation, found himself directly in the center of the crossfire. Enemy muzzle flashes erupted from positions that formed almost a perfect circle around Torres's location. The concentrated fire was so intense that Martinez was certain no human being could survive more than a few seconds in that position. Yet Torres not only survived, he seemed to thrive in the chaos. Martinez reported that Torres moved through the kill zone with what appeared to be supernatural awareness, always knowing exactly when to duck, when to move, and where the next burst of fire would come from. He returned fire with devastating accuracy, eliminating 3 enemy positions in rapid succession while bullets continued to pass harmlessly around him. The engagement lasted nearly 20 minutes, during which Torres remained in the most dangerous part of the battlefield, exposed to fire from multiple directions. When the surviving Viet Cong finally withdrew, leaving behind 12 dead, Torres had not received so much as a scratch. His uniform showed numerous bullet holes, but his skin beneath remained unmarked. Specialist Gary Chen, the squad's radio man, had observed the entire engagement from a covered position approximately 50 meters away. Chen, who had grown up hunting in the mountains of Colorado and understood firearms, later stated that he had never seen anything like Torres's performance. "It wasn't just luck," Chen reported. "It was like he could see the bullets coming and knew exactly how to move to avoid them. No human being should be able to do what I saw him do." The medical examination conducted after the engagement revealed details that military doctors struggled to explain. Torres's uniform contained 17 bullet holes, including 6 that had passed through areas covering vital organs. The trajectory analysis indicated that these bullets should have caused fatal wounds, yet Torres showed no signs of injury whatsoever. Captain James Morrison, the battalion surgeon who examined Torres, documented findings that challenged his medical training. Morrison noted that while Torres appeared physically normal in every respect, his vital signs showed unusual patterns. His heart rate remained remarkably steady even during intense combat stress. His blood pressure readings were consistently optimal regardless of circumstances, and his reflexes tested at levels far exceeding normal human ranges. Most puzzling to Morrison were Torres's healing capabilities. Minor cuts and scrapes that Torres had received during normal field operations healed with extraordinary speed, often disappearing completely within hours. Morrison documented several instances where injuries that should have required medical attention had vanished by the time Torres reported to the aid station. Word of Torres's unusual survival abilities began to spread through the battalion, creating a mixture of awe and superstition among his fellow soldiers. Some viewed him as blessed, protected by divine intervention that allowed him to walk through enemy fire untouched. Others whispered about darker possibilities, wondering if Torres had made some kind of bargain that placed him beyond death's reach. Torres himself seemed uncomfortable with the attention his survival abilities generated. He was a quiet, religious man who attended field services whenever possible and carried his grandfather's rosary in his left breast pocket. In private conversations with close friends, he expressed confusion about his experiences, admitting that he couldn't explain what was happening to him any more than anyone else could. The transformation in Torres's role within the unit was gradual but undeniable. His squad leader, Sergeant Martinez, began positioning Torres in increasingly dangerous situations, knowing that somehow Torres would not only survive, but would likely turn the tactical situation to their advantage. Torres became the man they sent when missions seemed impossible, when the odds were stacked too heavily against success. By December 1965, Torres had been involved in 17 separate combat engagements. In each case, he had been positioned in circumstances that should have resulted in death or serious injury. In each case, he had emerged without harm while inflicting devastating casualties on enemy forces. His survival rate was not just statistically improbable, it was mathematically impossible according to standard combat analysis. The official records from this period, recently declassified through Freedom of Information Act requests, reveal that Torres's company had achieved casualty ratios that exceeded those of elite special forces units. While sustaining minimal losses themselves, they had eliminated enemy forces at rates that impressed even veteran commanders who had served in World War II and Korea. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Patterson, who commanded the 2nd Battalion during this period, noted in his confidential reports that Torres had become what military strategists call a force multiplier, a single individual whose presence significantly enhanced the combat effectiveness of his entire unit. Patterson wrote, "PFC Torres has demonstrated capabilities that exceed anything in my 20 years of military experience. His presence in combat situations appears to generate outcomes that favor our forces in ways that cannot be explained through conventional tactical analysis." But Torres's abilities extended beyond merely surviving enemy fire. His fellow soldiers began to notice that his presence seemed to affect the battlefield in subtle but measurable ways. Enemy weapons would jam at critical moments. Carefully planned ambushes would be discovered just in time. And intelligence that proved crucial would arrive through seemingly random channels. Sergeant First Class William Dutch Kruger was the first to document what he called the Torres effect. Kruger, a 20-year Army veteran who had served in both World War II and Korea, kept a detailed personal journal throughout his Vietnam deployment. His entries from January 1966 describe phenomena that seemed to center. According to Kruger's journal, enemy around Torres's presence in ways that defied conventional military understanding. Mortar attacks that should have been devastatingly accurate would consistently fall short or long when Torres was in the target area. Radio intercepts that provided crucial intelligence would come through with perfect clarity during operations involving Torres, while similar communications remained garbled during missions he didn't participate in. Most remarkably, the weather itself seemed to cooperate when Torres was involved in critical operations. The meteorological observations were particularly striking. Staff Sergeant Antonio Rodriguez, who served as the company's forward observer and maintained detailed weather logs, noted that fog would lift at precisely the right moments to allow Torres's squad clear fields of fire, while rain would begin just as they needed concealment for withdrawal. Rodriguez, a former seminary student with a background in natural sciences, struggled to reconcile these patterns with his understanding of atmospheric conditions. In his classified report to Division Intelligence, Rodriguez wrote, "The correlation between favorable weather conditions and Private Torres's combat operations exceeds any reasonable expectation of coincidence. I have observed meteorological phenomena that appear to respond to tactical requirements in ways that suggest external influence beyond natural atmospheric processes." The most documented example of the Torres effect occurred during Operation Cedar Falls in January 1967. Torres's company had been tasked with clearing a heavily fortified village complex that intelligence estimated contained 2 companies of North Vietnamese regulars. The operation was considered so dangerous that it had been postponed 3 times due to the projected casualty rates. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson reluctantly approved the mission only after Torres volunteered to take point for the initial assault. The attack began at dawn, with Torres leading a 12-man squad through a maze of bunkers and tunnel entrances that should have been a killing ground for defending forces. Captain Richard Hayes, who coordinated the operation from a command post 800 meters away, watched through field glasses as Torres moved through the village complex. Hayes later testified that what he observed challenged every principle of small unit tactics he had learned in 2 decades of military service. Torres seemed to know instinctively where enemy positions were located, even when they were completely concealed from view. He would signal his squad to avoid certain areas moments before hidden explosive devices detonated harmlessly behind them. Enemy soldiers who had perfect opportunities for ambush would hesitate at crucial moments, allowing Torres to eliminate them before they could fire. The engagement lasted 4 hours and resulted in the complete destruction of 2 enemy companies, with the loss of only 1 American soldier, who was wounded when he failed to follow Torres's hand signals and triggered a booby trap. The casualty ratio was unprecedented in the division's combat history. Medical Corpsman Danny Sullivan, who had been attached to Torres's squad for the operation, provided the most detailed account of what happened during the village clearing. Sullivan noted that Torres seemed to anticipate wounds before they occurred, positioning himself to provide immediate medical assistance to soldiers who were about to be injured. In 3 separate instances, Sullivan watched Torres pull men to safety seconds before enemy fire would have struck them. Most remarkably, Sullivan observed that Torres appeared to be communicating with his squad members without speaking or using conventional hand signals. Men would change direction or take cover based on what seemed to be unspoken communication from Torres, avoiding danger they couldn't possibly have detected themselves. By February 1967, Torres had been promoted to sergeant and was leading his own squad. His reputation had spread throughout the 1st Infantry Division, creating a situation that concerned higher command. Soldiers were requesting transfers to serve under Torres, believing that his presence guaranteed their survival. Other units complained that their own morale suffered when compared to the seemingly invincible soldiers who fought alongside the Ghost Walker. Brigadier General Kenneth Morrison, who commanded the division during this period, faced an unprecedented problem. Torres's combat effectiveness was undeniable, but his influence on military discipline was becoming problematic. Soldiers were beginning to attribute supernatural powers to Torres, creating a cult of personality that threatened normal command structures. Morrison ordered a comprehensive investigation into Torres's background, medical history, and combat record. The investigation team included military intelligence officers, army physicians, and a psychiatrist specially flown in from Walter Reed Army Medical Center. Their findings, classified until 1997, revealed details that raised more questions than answers. Dr. Margaret Chen, the psychiatrist who conducted extensive interviews with Torres, reported that he displayed none of the typical psychological markers associated with combat stress or unusual battlefield experiences. Torres's mental state remained remarkably stable, despite exposure to trauma that would have severely affected most soldiers. His sleep patterns were normal. He showed no signs of hypervigilance or paranoid behavior, and his emotional responses appeared completely appropriate to his circumstances. What concerned Dr. Chen were the subtle differences in Torres's neurological responses during testing. His reaction times were consistently faster than the normal human range. His spatial awareness exceeded standard measurements, and his ability to process multiple sources of sensory input simultaneously was remarkable. Most puzzling were his responses to questions about his combat experiences. Torres consistently described his survival as being guided by what he called the voice, an internal awareness that provided warning of danger and guidance during combat situations. He insisted this was not a hallucination or psychological coping mechanism, but rather a form of communication he had learned to trust completely. Dr. Chen's attempts to categorize this phenomenon within established psychological frameworks proved unsuccessful. The medical examination conducted by Colonel David Thornton, the division's chief surgeon, produced results that challenged conventional understanding of human physiology. Torres's cardiovascular system functioned at levels typically seen only in elite athletes, despite his average physical training regimen. His reflexes tested at superhuman levels, and his visual acuity exceeded the maximum measurements on standard equipment. Most remarkable were the healing observations documented during Torres's brief hospitalization for a routine appendectomy in March 1967. The surgical team noted that Torres's tissue regeneration occurred at approximately 3 times the normal rate. The incision healed completely within 4 days, leaving no visible scar. Blood tests showed cellular activity that Dr. Thornton described as unprecedented in medical literature. The investigation's most disturbing discovery came from analysis of Torres's combat photography. Military photographers had documented several of Torres's engagements for training and intelligence purposes. Frame-by-frame analysis of these photographs revealed details that seemed to violate basic laws of physics. In multiple images, bullets could be seen in flight around Torres's position, their trajectories clearly visible due to the high-speed photography techniques used. Computer analysis of these images showed that several bullets should have struck Torres based on their trajectories and his position at the moment the photographs were taken. Yet subsequent frames showed Torres unharmed, having apparently moved in ways that defied human reaction times. Lieutenant James Murphy, the intelligence officer who supervised the photographic analysis, reported findings that he admitted seemed impossible. Murphy had studied combat photography extensively and understood the technical limitations of both cameras and human movement. His analysis indicated that Torres was moving between individual frames of film, exposed at thousandths of a second apart, suggesting reaction speeds that exceeded human capability by orders of magnitude. The investigation team's final report, submitted to General Morrison in April 1967, recommended that Torres be transferred to a special research unit for further study. The report suggested that Torres represented either an unprecedented example of human adaptation to extreme stress or evidence of phenomena that lay outside current scientific understanding. However, before these recommendations could be implemented, Torres volunteered for an extended tour and requested assignment to the most dangerous operations available. General Morrison, faced with the choice between potentially losing his most effective soldier to research or utilizing Torres's abilities to save American lives, chose to keep Torres in combat operations while maintaining discreet observation of his activities. This decision would prove to have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Torres's influence on his fellow soldiers was creating changes that military psychologists were only beginning to understand. Men who served with Torres for extended periods began displaying enhanced survival instincts, improved combat performance, and psychological resilience that persisted even when they were transferred to other units. Dr. Robert Sterling, a military psychologist who studied these secondary effects, documented what he termed proximity enhancement among soldiers who had served with Torres. These men showed statistically significant improvements in marksmanship, tactical awareness, and battlefield survival rates compared to soldiers with similar training and experience who had not served with Torres. The implications of Sterling's research raised questions that went to the heart of military effectiveness and human potential. If Torres's presence could enhance the capabilities of other soldiers, understanding and replicating this effect could revolutionize military training and combat effectiveness. Yet the mechanisms behind these improvements remained completely mysterious. As Torres entered his second tour of duty in Vietnam, the mystery of his abilities continued to deepen. The young farm boy from Nebraska had become something unprecedented in military history, a soldier whose presence on the battlefield seemed to alter the fundamental rules of combat itself. But the most extraordinary chapters of his story were still to come. The second tour began in September 1967, with Torres assigned to the 173rd Airborne Brigade, a unit that specialized in the most dangerous deep reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines. Command had decided that Torres's unique abilities would be most valuable in situations where conventional tactics offered little hope of success. What they didn't anticipate was that Torres's capabilities would continue to evolve in ways that defied every previous observation. Captain Michael O'Brien, Torres's new company commander, had been briefed on Torres's reputation, but remained skeptical about the reports he'd received. O'Brien was a West Point graduate who believed in training, discipline, and tactical superiority, rather than what he considered battlefield superstitions. His attitude changed dramatically after Torres's first mission with the 173rd. The assignment was a reconnaissance patrol deep into the A Shau Valley, an area so heavily defended by North Vietnamese forces that it was known as the Valley of Death among American troops. Intelligence needed confirmation of enemy troop buildups in preparation for what would later become the Tet Offensive. Previous patrols sent into the area had either been wiped out completely or had returned with such heavy casualties that the intelligence gathered was considered unreliable. Torres volunteered to lead a 6-man reconnaissance team into the valley, despite being new to the unit and unfamiliar with his team members. Staff Sergeant Robert "Tank" Williams, a veteran of 37 combat missions who had been selected as Torres's second-in-command, later described his initial reaction as skeptical, bordering on hostile. Williams had lost too many good men to believe that any individual soldier, regardless of reputation, could significantly alter the odds in such a dangerous environment. He viewed Torres as either incredibly lucky or the beneficiary of exaggerated reports. This skepticism lasted exactly 18 hours into their mission. The team had been moving through triple canopy jungle for 2 days when they encountered what appeared to be a company-sized North Vietnamese patrol moving along a well-established trail. Standard reconnaissance doctrine called for the American team to remain hidden, observe enemy movements, and radio intelligence back to headquarters. Direct engagement with such a large enemy force would have been considered suicidal for a 6-man patrol. Torres made a decision that violated every principle of reconnaissance operations. He signaled his team to prepare for an ambush of the North Vietnamese column. Williams later testified that he initially refused to follow Torres's orders, considering them tantamount to a suicide command. The enemy force outnumbered them by at least 15 to 1 and was moving through terrain that offered the Americans no avenue of escape. Torres's response to Williams's objections was simple and direct. He informed Williams that he could see exactly how the engagement would unfold, that every member of their team would survive, and that the intelligence they gathered from the enemy dead would be crucial to preventing a major attack on American positions. Williams, faced with a direct order from his patrol leader, reluctantly positioned his men for the ambush. What followed was the most one-sided engagement Williams had witnessed in 3 tours of combat duty. Torres seemed to know precisely when and where each enemy soldier would appear on the trail. His first shot killed the North Vietnamese point man at the exact moment that would cause maximum confusion among the following troops. His subsequent fire was so accurate and perfectly timed that the enemy column disintegrated into chaos within seconds. The engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. When the firing stopped, 37 North Vietnamese soldiers lay dead on the trail, while Torres's team had not suffered a single casualty. More remarkably, the Americans had expended less than 200 rounds of ammunition, achieving a kill ratio that exceeded even the most optimistic projections for prepared defensive positions. Specialist David Park, the team's radio man, had monitored enemy communications during the engagement using a captured North Vietnamese radio. Park, who spoke fluent Vietnamese, reported that the enemy soldiers had seemed confused about the size and location of the American force attacking them. Their radio communications indicated they believed they were under assault by at least a full company of troops positioned in multiple locations simultaneously. The intelligence gathered from the enemy dead exceeded anything previous reconnaissance missions had obtained. Documents found on the North Vietnamese officers revealed detailed plans for coordinated attacks on American bases throughout the region, troop movement schedules that would allow American forces to intercept enemy reinforcements, and supply routes that could be targeted to disrupt enemy operations for months. Captain O'Brien, who had remained skeptical about Torres's abilities despite the briefings he'd received, found himself facing evidence that challenged his fundamental understanding of small unit tactics. The after-action report he filed with brigade headquarters described tactical achievements that seemed impossible for a 6-man patrol operating in heavily defended enemy territory. More disturbing to O'Brien were the secondary effects he began observing in soldiers who served with Torres. The men who had participated in the A Shao Valley mission returned with enhanced capabilities that persisted long after the patrol ended. Their marksmanship scores improved dramatically. Their tactical awareness in subsequent missions exceeded their previous performance, and their psychological resilience to combat stress showed marked enhancement. Sergeant Williams, who had been openly skeptical of Torres before the mission, became one of his most devoted followers afterward. Williams requested permanent assignment to Torres's team and began displaying tactical instincts that surprised even his veteran colleagues. In his personal letters home, Williams wrote about experiencing what he called battlefield clarity that allowed him to anticipate enemy actions and react to threats before they fully developed. The phenomenon was not limited to combat performance. Medical corpsman Tony Rodriguez, who had been attached to Torres's team for the A Shao mission, reported that his medical skills had somehow improved following extended exposure to Torres's presence. Rodriguez found himself able to diagnose injuries and illnesses with accuracy that exceeded his training, and his success rate with emergency medical procedures increased dramatically. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, a military physician who studied these secondary effects, documented improvements in cognitive function, physical coordination, and sensory perception among soldiers who had served with Torres for extended periods. Her research indicated that proximity to Torres seemed to enhance human capabilities in ways that current medical science couldn't explain. The most remarkable case study involved Private First Class Jimmy Chen, a soldier who had suffered severe combat wounds during a mission with Torres in October 1967. Chen had been struck by shrapnel from a mortar round that should have caused permanent disability. However, his recovery occurred at a rate that amazed the medical staff treating him. Chen's wounds healed completely within 6 weeks, leaving no visible scars or functional impairment. More remarkably, Chen reported that his physical capabilities following recovery exceeded his pre-injury condition. His strength, endurance, and reflexes all tested at levels significantly higher than his baseline measurements taken during initial military processing. Dr. Hoffman's investigation into Chen's recovery revealed cellular regeneration patterns that she described as unprecedented in medical literature. Tissue samples showed activity levels that exceeded normal human healing processes by significant margins. Blood work indicated immune system function that approached theoretical maximums for human physiology. The implications of these findings created considerable concern among military medical personnel. If Torres's presence could enhance healing and physical performance in other soldiers, the potential applications for military medicine were revolutionary. Yet attempts to understand or replicate these effects proved completely unsuccessful. Colonel James Patterson, who supervised the medical research into Torres's abilities, authorized a series of controlled experiments designed to measure and quantify the enhancement effects. Torres was assigned to work with different groups of soldiers under carefully monitored conditions, with comprehensive medical and psychological testing conducted before, during, and after exposure periods. The experimental results confirmed Dr. Hoffman's observations while raising additional questions about the mechanisms involved. Soldiers who worked closely with Torres showed measurable improvements in reaction time, visual acuity, physical strength, and cognitive processing speed. These improvements appeared within days of initial contact and persisted for months after separation from Torres. Most puzzling was the discovery that the enhancement effects seemed to be permanent. Soldiers who had served with Torres years earlier continued to demonstrate superior performance compared to their peers, suggesting that whatever changes Torres's presence induced were lasting modifications rather than temporary improvements. Staff Sergeant Richard Murphy, who had served with Torres during his first tour and had been transferred to a different unit, was recalled for testing as part of the experimental program. Murphy's performance measurements 2 years after his last contact with Torres still exceeded normal human ranges in multiple categories. His tactical awareness, marksmanship accuracy, and physical conditioning remained at levels that surpassed soldiers with similar training and experience. The research team's attempts to identify the mechanisms behind these enhancements proved frustrating. Blood samples from enhanced soldiers showed no unusual chemical markers. Brain scans revealed no structural abnormalities, and genetic testing indicated no mutations or modifications. Whatever Torres was doing to improve other soldiers' capabilities operated through pathways that existing medical science couldn't detect or measure. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a neurologist brought in to study the cognitive enhancements, proposed that Torres might be influencing other soldiers through what she termed quantum entanglement at the neurological level. Warren theorized that Torres's brain might be operating in ways that created sympathetic responses in nearby individuals, enhancing their neural processing through mechanisms that existed outside current understanding of brain function. Warren's research focused on measuring electromagnetic activity in the brains of soldiers exposed to Torres's presence. Her findings indicated unusual synchronization patterns between Torres's brainwaves and those of nearby individuals. During combat simulations, soldiers working with Torres showed neural activity that mirrored his own patterns, suggesting some form of direct brain-to-brain communication. The implications of Warren's research were staggering. If Torres could somehow share his enhanced capabilities with other soldiers through direct neural influence, the potential military applications were limitless. An entire army could theoretically be enhanced through contact with individuals like Torres, creating fighting forces with capabilities far exceeding normal human limitations. However, attempts to replicate Warren's findings proved inconsistent. The neural synchronization effects appeared to be strongest during actual combat situations and weakened significantly under laboratory conditions. This suggested that Torres's abilities were somehow linked to combat stress and battlefield conditions in ways that couldn't be artificially reproduced. The mystery deepened when researchers discovered that Torres's enhancement effects weren't limited to military personnel. Civilian doctors and nurses who treated Torres during his brief hospitalizations reported temporary improvements in their own professional capabilities. Medical procedures that normally challenge their skills became surprisingly easy. Diagnostic accuracy improved dramatically, and patient outcomes exceeded normal expectations. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who performed Torres's appendectomy, documented her own enhanced performance during and after the surgery. Mitchell found herself able to perform surgical techniques that normally required years of specialized training, and her success rate with subsequent operations remained elevated for weeks after treating Torres. The civilian medical observation suggested that Torres's influence operated through mechanisms that transcended military training or combat experience. Whatever was enhancing other people's capabilities appeared to be a fundamental alteration in human potential, rather than an improvement in specific military skills. By early 1968, Torres had become the subject of intense scrutiny from military researchers, intelligence agencies, and medical specialists. His combat record was unprecedented, his survival rate defied statistical analysis, and his influence on other personnel created capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations. Yet Torres himself remained an enigma, a quiet soldier from Nebraska who seemed as puzzled by his abilities as the scientists studying him. The mystery was about to become even more complex. Torres's third and final tour in Vietnam would reveal capabilities that surpassed everything previously documented, transforming him from an exceptional soldier into something that challenged the very definition of human possibility. As Torres prepared for his third tour in early 1968, military command faced an unprecedented decision. The soldier they had once considered simply lucky had evolved into something that defied classification. Intelligence reports from his previous missions read like science fiction, yet the documentation was irrefutable. The Ghost Walker was no longer just surviving impossible situations. He was rewriting the fundamental rules of warfare itself. Colonel Harrison Webb, Torres's new commanding officer with the 5th Special Forces Group, had studied every available report on Torres's service record. Webb was a career officer who had served in Korea and understood the difference between battlefield legends and documented fact. What he discovered in Torres's classified files challenged 30 years of military experience and tactical understanding. Webb's initial meeting with Torres took place in a secure briefing room at Nha Trang Bas in February 1968. Webb later described his first impression of Torres as surprisingly ordinary, a soft-spoken sergeant who seemed uncomfortable with the attention his reputation generated. Yet, during their conversation, Webb noted subtle details that confirmed the extraordinary nature of the man sitting across from him. Torres spoke about combat situations with a detachment that suggested he experienced warfare differently than normal soldiers. He described anticipating enemy movements not through tactical analysis, but through what he called battlefield awareness that operated beyond conscious thought. Most remarkably, Torres seemed genuinely puzzled by questions about his survival abilities, insisting that he was simply following guidance he couldn't fully explain. The third tour assignment placed Torres with a special operations unit tasked with the most dangerous missions behind enemy lines. These were operations that conventional wisdom considered suicide runs, deep reconnaissance into heavily defended areas, sabotage missions against critical enemy infrastructure, and rescue operations in circumstances where normal extraction seemed impossible. Master Sergeant Frank Rodriguez, Torres's team leader, had volunteered to work with Torres despite warnings from other Special Forces personnel about the psychological effects of serving alongside the Ghost Walker. Rodriguez was a 20-year veteran who had survived missions throughout Southeast Asia by trusting his instincts and maintaining rigid adherence to proven tactics. Rodriguez's confidence in conventional special operations procedures lasted exactly 72 hours into his first mission with Torres. The assignment involved infiltrating a North Vietnamese command complex deep in Laos to gather intelligence on troop movements for the anticipated Tet offensive. Previous attempts to penetrate this facility had resulted in the complete loss of 3 separate reconnaissance teams. The mission began normally, with the 8-man team moving through dense jungle using standard infiltration techniques. Rodriguez maintained radio silence, followed established routes that avoided known enemy positions, and proceeded according to a carefully planned timeline that had been developed through months of intelligence analysis. Everything changed when Torres quietly informed Rodriguez that their planned route would lead directly into a company-sized North Vietnamese patrol moving along an intersecting trail. Torres provided precise details about enemy strength, weapons, and timing that couldn't possibly have been obtained through normal reconnaissance methods. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres completed his 3rd tour in Vietnam and returned to the United States in December 1969. His service records remain partially classified to this day, with certain sections redacted under national security provisions that have never been fully explained. Torres himself disappeared from public view shortly after his discharge, declining interviews and avoiding contact with military historians who sought to document his extraordinary experiences. The men who served with Torres carried their memories of the Ghost Walker for the rest of their lives. Some spoke quietly among themselves about abilities that challenged everything they thought they knew about human potential. Others took their secrets to the grave, unable to reconcile what they had witnessed with any rational explanation. What happened to Michael Torres in the jungles of Vietnam remains one of the most compelling mysteries in modern military history. Was he simply the beneficiary of extraordinary luck, protected by forces beyond human understanding? Or had he somehow transcended normal human limitations through mechanisms that science has yet to discover? The evidence suggests possibilities that extend far beyond conventional explanations. The truth about the man they couldn't kill may never be fully known. But his story serves as a reminder that even in humanity's darkest conflicts, mysteries persist that challenge our understanding of what human beings are truly capable of achieving when pushed beyond all conceivable limits.